All right, good afternoon. The grader has returned assignment number 8, and if you didn't already pick that up before class, you can get it on your way out. The papers are here. You've got another assignment due on Friday, the benefit cost analysis assignment. We're going to do something related to benefit cost analysis today with the cost effectiveness analysis. We'll get into that in a few minutes. And so next week you've got exam 2. And so I'll provide the formula sheet that you'll need for that. I gave some additional details about what's going to be on the test last class, and so I won't go into that again. But just as a reminder that the project, you really ought to get an early start on that. There were a couple of questions when I first handed it out, but those have tapered off dramatically, and I sometimes use the amount of questions I'm getting as an indication of how much students are working on the project, and so I sort of wonder if that's been put on the back burner for a while. I'd really encourage you to get an early start on that. It'll help you out a lot. Okay, before we get into the new material, I wanted to bring up the solution to the in-class exercise from last time. Last time we were doing incremental analysis of the benefits. Let me dim the lights so it's a little bit easier to see the screen here. This isn't the exact spreadsheet that I showed last time. I created the one from last time sort of on the fly from scratch, and this is a solution I have from a previous semester, but it's the same answers and it's following mostly the same procedure. So we were presented with 4 alternatives, and we were trying to figure out, if we've got an option that you can get for $3 million, why would you spend $9 million? And the question is, are you getting even more benefits than that incremental cost between alternatives? And so the first thing that we did here in this middle group of numbers is we just evaluated them according to benefit cost just to see if any one of them should be eliminated outright. Like if any of them are unacceptable because the costs outweigh the benefits. And what we saw is that none of them could be immediately rejected. And we also noticed that of these alternatives, option B had the highest B to C ratio. But that could give you the wrong idea, in the same way that you can get the wrong idea just by looking at interest rates, internal rate of return, comparing projects. You can't compare projects on the basis only of their B to C ratios, and so that's why we do the incremental analysis. And so the interpretation of B versus A is you're just looking at how much more expensive is B compared to A, and how much more benefits are there, what are the differences in disbenefits, and so on. And so you calculate the change between the 2 alternatives, and then you put the change of each of these categories into the conventional B to C ratio formula. And so this 2.57, the interpretation of that is that for every additional dollar of cost for project B, because it is more expensive, for each additional dollar of cost, you get $2.57 of benefit. And so should we do it? Absolutely. It's like you're spending $1 to get $2.57 in return. I think any of us would make that exchange. When we compare, and so now B is what we would stick with instead of A. B is sort of our current favorite. Our next comparison to the next most expensive alternative after B was C, but we reject that alternative because you only get 96 cents worth of benefit for every dollar of cost. And so the final comparison of D isn't against the one that we've just rejected, because we've just said C is a no-go. And so the final comparison is between D and the most recent yes before that, which is B. And so the $1.12, that ratio is above 1, which tells us go for the more expensive alternative. So are there any questions on this process of incremental B to C analysis? By the way, I apologize for how muggy it is in here. I don't know what the story is with that. It's sort of like a jungle. And I turned down the AC, but I don't know if that's going to do any good. In this class, occasionally we're going to talk about ethics. And part of the reason for that is that in engineering economy, as a discipline, there are some qualitative factors to it that are as much an art as a science. And you have to rely on professional experience and make judgments that affect a wide range of people. And the judgments that you make sometimes are based on non-quantitative factors. And so this is one of the first times we'll sort of look at some of the principles that people should keep in mind when they're making decisions based on economic analysis. And it's not just engineers that face these kinds of decisions. People in safety fields have to balance the risk versus reduction in profit for a company. When you're telling a company what money they should spend and which risk mitigation techniques they should use, all of those things cost money, and so you're balancing the value of human life and the value of human safety versus a reduction in profits. And the same thing is true in computer science, when you're balancing privacy and a whole host of issues versus profits. And so ethics should always be in the back of our mind. Now, we don't just do quantitative and technical work. People in our fields are often called to play decision-making roles in public policy and planning for projects. And so these affect a broad range of people. And when you go through the decision-making process, we have to be impartial, meaning that if you're working for a, let's say, an agency that's going to be making a decision on contracts, then that decision on contracts shouldn't be based on who is your friend or who have you worked for in the past, but obviously should be based on who gives the most competitive bid and who it looks like is going to give the highest quality results to the stakeholders. Realistic is mentioned here because there's sort of a dirty history in engineering economy of people making unrealistic assumptions on purpose because they wanted a project to go forward. They wanted, engineers love to build, for example. And so the only reason that you get to build is if there's a need and some sort of a justified need. And so in the past, there were companies and even federal agencies that would do these analyses and have unrealistic expectations about interest rates, for example, and how long projects would last and how much they would get used, just to make the conditions look like a project is justified. And then once it looks like the project is justified, then everyone eats. The engineers get to have plenty of work, so they're making a profit. And so we can't let go of realism just so that a project can go forward. And then the last part here, thorough in a wide range of circumstances, means that we should be attuned to the possibilities that sometimes things turn out as you don't expect. Like you have to plan a project not just for one interest rate, but look at the whole spectrum of possibilities of financing interest rates, or the performance of a contractor, what the quality of their work may be. If you're expecting a contractor to always do the perfect work and, for instance, concrete strengths to be at the far end of what's possible, then that could really lead to some bad results. And the book talks in a lot of detail and offers some interesting examples about each one of these, but the bottom line is that when you do economic analysis, there's some leeway there for interpretation and setting the conditions of the analysis. And once you start the calculations, everything's very straightforward, but oftentimes when you're saying, well, let's assume 5% interest, that starting point is going to affect all the calculations later on. And that's where these ethical considerations usually have their origin, is at the beginning underlying assumptions that you begin your analysis with for a project. And so here are some rhetorical questions. I think that the answer to each of these will be obvious, but they get asked because in the past, people have violated what seems obvious to us. So for instance, to accept publicly funded projects where the benefits are excluded to certain people. And so, there have been a lot of places in the world where there's been racial discrimination or economic discrimination where only a certain class of people got to enjoy benefits that were supposedly state-funded, and because they're state-funded, they should be open to everyone. Some people worry about the debt that you guys are going to face. Your generation didn't make any of the decisions about what the federal deficit should be spent on. And all of the borrowing that's been going on until now, there's this enormous bill that eventually is going to have to be paid. And the debt adds to the amount of taxes that people have to pay. And so sometimes people worry about the ethical implications of just sort of kicking the can down the road and saying, well, we'll let the next generation worry about global warming, or we'll let the next generation worry about crumbling infrastructure. We won't make the hard choices today, but we'll just sort of put that off for later. I spoke about this earlier, the idea of projects where the poor or minorities are disproportionately disbenefited. When we were talking about where a road goes, you know, oftentimes it's suggested to put interstate highways through poor areas because land is cheaper in poor areas. But then another part of that is just that poor people are in less of a position to put up a fight because they can't hire lawyers to the same extent that if the highway was going through a rich neighborhood, then people could afford lawyers to represent them and to fight that off. The noise effects in poor areas are less expensive to mitigate because people aren't going to fight as hard during the public meeting stages. And so obviously that sort of thing isn't ethical, to sort of target disbenefits to people who can't fight back or can't represent their own interests. Monetizing projects is where we're trying to assign a dollar value to things that maybe don't naturally have a dollar value. And so the cost of construction is easy to say what the dollar value of that. It's a little bit more challenging to say what's the dollar value of sitting in traffic because of a traffic jam. We can do it, but it requires a little bit of creativity. But now think about air pollution. How do you quantify the dollar value of emitting air pollution, or how much a company should be charged for polluting the air? It's really hard to say. And so there are certain things that companies are used to not having to pay for at all. For example, minimum wage positions often don't have any kind of benefits, no health benefits, no retirement benefits. And so companies that rely on a lot of part-time employees are essentially shifting the burden for health care and retirement costs to someone else. You know, they're saying, we'll just let the government cover that. Medicaid, we'll let the hospital's emergency fund cover that. And so that's an example of externalizing costs that maybe isn't ethical. We just have to ask that question. And the last thing is that sometimes we ignore problems that are hard to solve. You know, we love the problems that are easy to solve just because it makes us feel smart. But if a problem is challenging to understand, or it's really complicated, or it's going to take a long time, then there's just human nature to try and ignore that. And I think you know, these types of treaties that take lots of countries to agree, and then it's only when everyone agrees and everyone does it to get the benefit at the end, those are the kinds that are really challenging to implement. And so the same thing can be true in engineering economy. Sometimes we will have alternatives that are easy for us to put into a spreadsheet, and so we'll do those calculations and we'll kind of start loving those alternatives because we put together a nice spreadsheet for it. But there may be other options that are less attractive to us just because they're unfamiliar or it's more challenging to quantify the benefits. And so we should avoid situations where we become biased just because of our affinity for quantifiable data. So that's just to put in the back of your mind. We'll spend a little bit more time going into ethics in a future class, but since we had a little bit of extra time today, I want to introduce those ideas. Now, we're moving away from B2C analysis, which was one of our first methods for choosing among alternatives when you have cost only, meaning projects that you don't expect are going to generate sizable revenues. Here's another method for trying to choose from among alternatives, and this is even simpler than B2C analysis, because in benefit cost analysis, we're comparing the different benefits that each project can provide, and we're comparing differences in cost. In cost effectiveness analysis, we're saying all of the alternatives that we're comparing have the same benefit, and we're only focusing on differences in costs. Now the types of places where we may need to apply this are government projects, but it's more specific than that. This cost effectiveness analysis is usually applied in the service sector of public projects. And so services are different than physical things that are constructed, you know, like a dam or a road or a bridge. Those are all public service projects, but they're not tangible. These are, what we're going to be talking about today are intangible, so services. Examples of intangible things that are provided by the public sector would be healthcare, accounting, police, financial services. And so government does many of these things, and the benefits aren't physical of those. But there are benefits. Just the fact that it doesn't exist as a physical thing doesn't mean it doesn't have a benefit. And so let's take, for example, traffic cameras. It can be challenging to quantify the benefits of traffic cameras. And so that's part of the reason why we wouldn't use B2C analysis is, you know, how do you know the dollar value of traffic cameras? You know, we can use the cameras that are up at an intersection for potentially giving people tickets who run a red light, or we can use it just to try and predict where traffic flows are congested and have people avoid congested intersections, you know, so rerouting. But assigning a dollar value to that is kind of a tricky thing. The same thing is true for police work. You know, you can't say what's the economic benefit of having an officer on the street as they're going about their shift. Maybe they prevent a crime, maybe they help get a cat down out of the tree, I don't know. You know, police officers do a wide range of things, but assigning a dollar value to each one of the tasks that they do through the day is maybe a little bit unrealistic. And so what we're going to do instead in cost effectiveness analysis is just look at costs rather than trying to focus on the benefits. So here's the formula for the cost effectiveness analysis. It's basically the cost effectiveness ratio. That's what the R stands for, is ratio. In the numerator, you have all of the costs of some activity, whatever service is being provided. And so the costs may include like salaries. It could include the utility costs or vehicle costs, rents of an office being up and running. And in the denominator, we'll have some sort of a measure of productivity. So in the case of a police officer, it could be the number of speeding tickets written during a month. If you think about accounting, it could be the number of tax returns processed in a week. If we're talking about health care, it could be the number of patients that a nurse is providing services to during a shift. So it's just however, you know, whatever the main job tasks are for this organization or individual, we measure how effectively they do it and we put it in the denominator. And so this ratio, what do you think you'd like? The ratio to be high or the ratio to be low? When you're doing an analysis like this and you're trying to pick from among alternatives, do you want the alternative with the highest ratio or the alternative with the lowest ratio? Lowest. Why would we want the ratio to be the lowest?
Because that one is more effective.
Right. So what you want to do is you want to maximize effectiveness and minimize costs. So we'll look at an illustration of that. Let's take, for instance, what if we had some government office that's processing passport applications? You know, you can send off a passport application to Charleston, South Carolina. Depending on where you live, it may go to New Orleans or Washington, D.C. or San Francisco. So there's different offices that are all doing the same thing. They're looking at your pictures, looking up your background information, and issuing a passport. If you have capital rationing, meaning there's some sort of a budget limit, the $1,600 per hour is capital rationing. You can't have all of these offices operating at once because if you add up their operation costs, it's going to exceed the amount of money that's available. We've only got $1,600 per hour that we can spend. And so what we want to do is we want to spend the money where it matters the most. And so we have to figure out how efficient is each of these offices at what they're doing. So the data that we have for these 4 offices is how much it costs to operate them, and that can be a reflection of their office space expenses. It could be the salaries in that location and lots of other factors. We've just added them all together with the costs. So you can see that's abbreviated with C. And then here we have a measure of effectiveness, which is how many applications they process every month. Now at first glance it may look like Office C is the best because it's processing the most applications per month. But they also have the highest operational costs. So we don't yet have it compared on an apples to apples basis where we can look and see who's doing the best work. It's here in column 4 where we calculate costs relative to expenses that we can start to see the picture a little more clearly. Once we calculate that, it looks like whoever has the lowest C to E ratio is Office B. They are, now the interpretation of this, the units get a little bit weird because in the numerator was dollars per hour and in the denominator is applications per month. So don't worry necessarily about what these units represent, but what you should keep in mind is that the lowest is always the best here. And so the lowest one is Office B, which is 5.1 cents in terms of dollars per hour per application per month. And so what we could do now is we can sort it between here and here. I'm simply putting the cheapest one first. And so that would be our first priority, is to give money to Office B. Because we've got limited budget, we should fund them all the way. And then our second best option is Office A, because they're spending 6.3 cents for the same work that Office B does for 5.1 cents. And now this final column 5 is the cumulative cost. Remember, we have to keep in mind the $1,600 per hour, and so if we're only choosing option B, then we're spending $450 per hour. But then if we also are funding Office A, then it would be the total cumulative cost would be the cost of Office B and the cost of Office A together, which is $1,325. And so $1,600 per hour means that we should definitely do B and A. And in some cases, you can partially fund the next alternative. So we could say any leftover money between $1,325 and $1,600, we'd take that leftover money and partially fund option C. Sometimes partial funding is an alternative, sometimes it's not. Again, this budget limit is sometimes called capital rationing, where you want to spend your limited dollars on whichever office or alternative is going to provide the best value. Any questions about the method? All right, here is the in-class exercise for today. Now, I suggested that you should bring your computers. This one you probably can do without a computer if you don't have one, although, you know, it's going to be a lot of number crunching with the calculator. So this one is about poaching, and there are 5 different NGOs, which is a non-governmental organization that is trying to prevent poaching of endangered gorillas. And so we've got a certain budget, and we need to find out where to spend that limited budget. This is a little bit different from the example I just showed you, because the total costs aren't given directly. I've provided some information that you need to use to calculate the total costs, but the costs aren't just given outright. There's 2 there. Does everybody have a copy of the paper? Okay, so here's the formula, the cost-effectiveness ratio formula. We know for each of these alternatives how many people they've got, what their salaries are. So you're going to use that for understanding their total costs. And then the effectiveness here, we want to maximize the number of poachers that get arrested. And so you can see each year the number of poachers that they've been arresting. So for step A, calculate the CER for each of the alternatives based on the total costs, and then rank them in terms of who's the most effective to the least effective, and then apply the budget limit of $5 million to decide if no partial funding is allowed, then who should be funded. Excel has a nice tool that allows you to rank a list. If we select, for example, we want to have from lowest to highest based here, and we could go here to, there it is, sort, smallest to largest. Yeah, expand. I think if we say expand, it's going to include these other cells to the left of it. And so now we've got C at the top because it has the lowest, and then A is next, and the worst is D. Who knows what those guys at Gorilla Watch are doing? So what these all represent is this would be the number of dollars in salary they're paying each year for each poacher that's arrested. And so we need to have a final column that's the cumulative cost. And so the first year is just going to be the program cost of option C. Then the next one is going to be the previous program's cost plus the cost of the next one. So A is helping hands, so the sum of those two together, and we can just drag this down. So if we were going to try and fund all of them, it would take $7.3 million. But in the example, we have a $5 million limit, and it says no partial funding. And so who would we fund? Well, we would have to say yes to the first couple and then no to the others. And so these guys would be a yes, yes, yes. But we can't fund these guys because the cumulative cost exceeds the budget. And so the anticipated poachers to be arrested if the past data is any guide, then what we will end up with, we'll just total the three that are funding. So we would add these three together, and we can expect to have 495 poachers arrested for the $5 million that we spend. Any question about cost effectiveness analysis? All right. We've still got 10 minutes. Those of you who are already finished and got the right answer, you're free to leave. I'm going to stick around and answer any questions that come up. Let me just mention a couple things, though. Don't forget to pick up your assignment, and if you have other things you haven't got before, you can get it from the box that's beside my office door. There's loads of old quizzes, even exams that people haven't picked up yet. So it's right in my office, which is the next building over. Also, if you have concerns about the homework, come see me in my office. I'm happy to go over it with you. If you think the grader has made a mistake, have a look at what the grader said, and if he identified a mistake, try and figure it out. But then if you're still not sure why you had points deducted, you can come to my office. We'll look over the solution together. And if you think that you were unfairly penalized, I want to make sure that you get those points back. So that's it for today. I will see you on Friday.